Well, once again, good morning, Dewtill Church. Got to admit, it is great to be back with you, up front, that is. I've been having fun sitting with you the last couple of months. But I also want you to keep Pastor Tom and family in prayer for safe travel as they're on their vacation time. Now, we are still in our summer series dealing with the idea of wisdom. And you know, I've discovered that you can find wisdom in some very unexpected places. 2 weekends back, my whole family got together and we all went and watched the new Indiana Jones movie. Now, we did that because that series has been a favorite of the entire family from the beginning. Now, I have to admit, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is the one I like the best. You can't miss with Harrison Ford and Sean Connery. Let's be honest. But wisdom? Yes, and it comes out at the end of the movie. Now let me set the scene for you. Both Indiana Jones and the good guys, plus all the villains, have found the location of the Grail. Now the villains force Indiana to navigate all the traps that have been set to prevent access to the Grail, which he does successfully. And as he enters the room where the Grail is, he meets the old knight that has guarded the Grail for centuries. But of course, our villains also find the way in. Now, the archvillain wants to use the Holy Grail to achieve immortality. So after looking around, he picks what is clearly and obviously the right Grail. And he takes a good, long drink of water and promptly dies a very gruesome death. Now, the old knight then speaks a very interesting observation. Let's watch.
He chose poorly.
He chose poorly. Don't you love that line? It's got to be the understatement of the entire movie. So what's wisdom? Choosing wisely. I mean, the last thing I want to ever hear from God is, you chose poorly. Okay, but let's continue. Indiana Jones has to find the right Grail. And he uses his knowledge and experience to make a wise choice and finds the true Grail. And in doing so, he's able to save his father's life. Okay? So what is wisdom? Using knowledge and experience to make a good choice. Now, as the movie comes to its climax, our villains again make a disastrous choice, which causes a catastrophe to happen. And the Grail is just out of reach. Can Indy get it? Let's look at the next clip.
I can get it. I can almost reach it, Dad.
Indiana?
Indiana? Let it go.
Now remember, Sean Connery's character has been searching for the Grail his entire life. But he's able to say what? Let it go. Because he has a priority. He'd rather have his son than the Grail. And in that scene, we see Indiana Jones figuring it out. I don't want the Grail. I want my dad. I want my family. I want my friends. What's wisdom? Choosing the right priority. Actually, it's knowing the right priority. As we call it, keeping the main thing the main thing. So, wisdom, using our knowledge and experience to make a good choice. Secondly, knowing what the main thing is. Have we defined wisdom? Yes, but we have another problem. How do I use my knowledge and experience to choose wisely? And priority, that's a good thing, but what is our main priority? How do I choose the proper priority? All we've done is we've moved our question back one level. And we're still needing to learn what wisdom is. Now, in previous weeks, Both Pastor Tom and Bud have guided us in a lot of different ways in learning various aspects of wisdom. They've helped us unlock some real gems out of our scriptures as we've asked a bunch of questions about wisdom. But if we've been listening carefully, every week was grounded in one inescapable truth. Wisdom begins with God. The more we know God, the better we learn wisdom. The better our relationship with Jesus Christ, the better we choose wisely. The better we understand God's plan and purpose, the better our wisdom works. But you see, that uncovers another problem. What if God's wisdom runs counter to the prevailing wisdom of our culture and our world? How do we choose? And that, in fact, is the very problem that the Apostle Paul is writing about in today's scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He's dealing with that issue. So let's start and begin to read through and understand what Paul's talking about. I'm going to begin 1 Corinthians chapter 1 with verses 18 and 19. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will, what? Frustrate. So note, right from the start, Paul is creating a dichotomy. He is playing off a dualism between foolishness and wisdom. In fact, he begins by pointing out that the central truth of Christianity, the cross of Christ, appears as foolishness to the world, despite the fact that it's the core of God's wisdom. Now, Paul's going to continue to develop this idea in the next couple of verses. So let's read verses 20 and 21. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Now again, did you notice again, Paul sets up a distinction. The wisdom of the world, or we might say, call it the prevailing or accepted wisdom of any culture, and the wisdom of God. The world believes that God's wisdom is actually foolishness. And yet, as Paul points out, God uses that so-called foolishness to save us. That is, to give us new life, new starts and new beginnings, to renew us, to restore us, to remake us. Well, if that's foolishness, I want more of it, right? But did you notice once again, Paul is talking about that distinction. What the world considers wise may not be what God defines as wise. Now, Paul's about to get way more specific about how the world views God's plans and purposes for our lives. Let's continue with verse 24. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Now, again, we see that Paul points out that the main message of Christianity, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and what it means and what it represents, just does not make sense to the people of Paul's era. Now, he talked about two groups. He called them Jews and Greeks, or Jews and Gentiles. Now, please understand, those were the two main cultural groups who had begun to come to faith in Jesus Christ. And in both of those groups, there were people who just couldn't get it. But why? Because the cross, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, did not fit either culture's definition of wisdom. So at the core, Why did these two cultures in our first century world so badly miss God's wisdom that was illustrated in the life, the teaching, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, the problem is something we call their worldview. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, so before we go any deeper, let's define what that word means. So, what's a worldview? One, it's a fundamental orientation of an individual, society, or culture, encompassing the whole of the individual or society or culture's knowledge and point of view. Another way we could define it is as a set of beliefs about fundamental aspects of reality that ground and influence all of our what? Perceiving, thinking, knowing, and doing. Catch that? So a worldview, we could also call it the accepted wisdom of a culture or the prevailing wisdom of a culture. We could even call it the mindset of a culture. As long as we understand that when we use those terms, we're talking about something that defines everything else. A worldview is our basic understanding of how the world works. Now, a worldview, you and I have one too. It's not just the first century people that Paul was writing to. We have a worldview that defines our basic understanding of the world. Now, Paul wrote that God's wisdom was a stumbling block to the Jews. Now, why? Well, their culture, their worldview, gave them a definite understanding of what a Messiah was, what a Messiah would be, and what a Messiah would do. But Jesus didn't fit the worldview. See, their worldview did not leave room for a suffering Messiah, a dying Messiah, or even a servant Messiah. They just couldn't get Jesus because he was outside the prevailing wisdom of their religious outlook, their religious mindset. They didn't get him. Next, Paul wrote that God's wisdom was foolishness to the Greeks. Now, by the Greeks, he's just using them as an example of the other main culture of his day. Now, again, why? Because their worldview could not encompass who Jesus was and what Jesus did. Now, for instance, the Greek culture, their worldview simply could not understand resurrection. It was beyond what their mindset allowed them to perceive and understand. For that matter, in Greek culture, their worldview had trouble with the fact there was only one true God. Remember that culture was what we call polytheistic or pagan. They had more gods than you have fingers and toes. But again, you see the point. If you bought into their worldview, their prevailing wisdom, then who Jesus was and what Jesus did simply was outside your understanding. Now, a good example is in the book of Acts, chapter 17. Paul is preaching in the city of Athens. Athens is the philosophic and cultural capital of that culture. Some people in the audience thought that Paul was trying to introduce a new God whose name was resurrection. They just couldn't get it. Not because they were dumb, not because they were stupid, but because they were so immersed in their worldview. They couldn't move outside of it to hear what Paul was saying about Jesus. The prevailing wisdom of their culture, their worldview, did not permit them. And that is why in 1 Corinthians, Paul is making a distinction between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God. Now, before we chuckle over the obvious mistakes of those people in the first century, we better ask ourselves a serious question. Does the worldview of 21st century American culture allow us to perceive, understand, and receive God's wisdom? What if our culture puts similar kinds of roadblocks in our way as we seek to learn God's wisdom? Yeah, we have a worldview. We learn it from our culture. Well, and that better is we absorb it from our culture. It is literally the sea in which we swim. And that worldview may not always be consistent with God's wisdom. And when it isn't, if we are so caught up in our culture's prevailing wisdom, we will make bad choices. We will choose poorly. Now, let me give you an easy example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Can we agree that our culture is just steeped in materialism and consumerism? Would that be a yes? We know that. Materialism and consumerism is baked into American culture, part of the worldview. Now, do you think God's wisdom is steeped in materialism and consumerism? No. Yeah, and I know right now some of you are thinking, Pastor Jim, you chose poorly with that question. Because the answer's obvious, isn't it? Of course God's not going to buy into that, right? So we can easily see where that part of our culture's worldview is inconsistent with God's wisdom. But wait a minute, it still remains a huge part of our culture. So much so that many in our culture will regard your refusal to live by materialism as foolishness. And think about this, despite virtually irrefutable evidence that materialism just doesn't work as a way of life, how many people in our culture are still trapped by it? Quite a few, right? Well, how could that be? If it's so obvious, how can so many people still be trapped? Well, because their worldview that they've bought into doesn't give them any other choice. A worldview is the sea that you swim in. And it takes hard work to see past or outside of any culture's worldview. You have to ask hard questions. You have to exercise awareness and insight and sometimes vigilance not to be trapped. You know, sometimes it's way easier just to swim in the stream and go along with the culture and not recognize how trapped you are. Now, when we use the example of materialism and consumerism, which is really part of the accepted wisdom of our culture, right? It's easy to see that is inconsistent with God's wisdom. But that's just one of the more clear examples. There's so many other areas where we struggle with our society's accepted wisdom and trying to figure out where it conflicts with God's wisdom. Just think of some of the things that we struggle with in our community or in our culture. You know, there's that difference between individualism versus the importance of community. There is how to deal with things like diversity and inclusion. There's the struggles, you know, in the political arena between the issues of right versus left. There's that huge issue of human sexuality and all the different directions it's taking us. And in each of those cases, the culture is going to have an accepted wisdom about what is right and what is wrong. In fact, I would point out that I'm using it worldview in the singular. In American culture, we might as well make it plural, worldviews, because our culture is not monolithic, and there are different groups and different voices and influences in our culture. But every one of them is going to have their accepted wisdom and their worldview. We have a problem, don't we? How do we figure out when that worldview is actually consistent with God's wisdom and when it is not? Now, I realize I'm not giving you some really good news right now, right? I've just told you that living into our Christian faith can sometimes be a hard journey. But don't give in just yet. Don't worry too much just yet. If we continue to read Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we're going to see some good news. So let's continue and pick up with chapter 1, verse 26. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Now, by called, what Paul means is when you came to faith in Jesus Christ, when you became a follower of Jesus. He goes on to say, not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. Now, Paul is describing his audience, the Christian community in the city of Corinth. Note well what he says about them. They were not the PhD level scholars of their day. They were not the accepted philosophers and teachers. They were not the educational elite, the political powerful, or the movers and shakers of the community. They weren't the one percenters and the A-listers. Now, to be sure, there were some exceptions. Historically, we know that some in the upper class of that culture became followers of Jesus. But for the most part, the Christian community were ordinary people. In fact, many of them were on the lowest rungs of their social ladder. Yet, they had learned God's wisdom. Somehow, those people that everyone else was looking down on, remember, not many of you were of noble birth, not many were considered wise, not many were influential, Paul writes. Despite that, they had somehow been able to move beyond the limitations of their worldview, beyond the accepted and prevailing wisdom of their day, and they had heard, learned, perceived, and accepted the good news of Jesus Christ, and it changed their lives. They had achieved something their elites had not. They had moved beyond the restrictions that their culture had set on them. In fact, Paul then goes on to write about the result, the impact of their choosing to follow Jesus Christ. We pick it up in verse 27. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and things that are not to nullify the things that are so that no one may boast before him. Now, those foolish, weak, lowly, and despised things, that was Paul's audience. Those were the Christian believers. Paul clearly makes the point that although his audience is not the top rungs of their community, God was using their example, using their model to shame the so-called wise, strong, high, and mighty. Now, how could that happen? Well, remember, it's actually not all that complicated. When confronted with the good news of the gospel, the good news of resurrection to new life, these people were able to move outside of the limitations of their culture's mindset and ask, is this true, this message about Jesus? How will it affect me? How can I be part of it? What will change in me? They asked hard questions. And then they heard, perceived, learned, and made it a reality in their lives. Now, here's the good news. You and I, we can do the very same thing that audience did almost 2,000 years ago. When we begin to ask those hard questions about our culture, we need to discern what is the prevailing wisdom of our culture. And then we begin to ask, okay, using my insight, my awareness, being vigilant, when does the prevailing wisdom of the culture become inconsistent with the wisdom God is teaching me? So, as long as we're willing to ask those hard questions, we can do the same thing Paul's audience did all of those centuries ago. And here's the other good news. When we do that, God can use our example. God can use the model of our lives. God can use the model of this church community to give an example to those around us of what it means to be renewed, remade, and restored. That can be good news to a lot of hurting people. So can we say an amen to that? Amen.